Hello and welcome to another podcast lifted by Lyfeproof. Today we're going to be talking about neurodiversity. I'm Millie, your host, and today we are joined by Dan. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Dan. I'm a 24-year-old photographer and I have autism and ADHD.
So before we get started today, we should probably clarify some key words just in case people don't know what we mean. That always helps. So neurodiversity is the definition of any kind of brain which is different from the norm. So this includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, anything that could be defined as like a mental health disorder. And so the opposite of this is neurotypical. So this is just a brain without those things. That being said, let's start. So how has being neurodiverse impacted your life?
So it's always a tricky one to actually talk about because I grew up in a family where it was encouraged, I was supported through it, so it never became an issue for me. But then as soon as I hit school, that's when it started to change. That's when there were expectations that I never had at home, and I think that's kind of the main way it's impacted. There's expectations there for neurotypical people that if you're neurodiverse, you're expected to still follow, even though your brain is literally not built to be able to in a lot of cases.
I get that completely. So do you think these expectations kind of make the mental health scene a bit more difficult for neurodivergent people compared to neurotypical people?
Oh, 100%. It's a minefield if you're neurodiverse. If you neurotypical and you go through a bad event and need therapy for it, it's so much easier to find someone that works with you. There's not the same kind of stigma around it. But if you're autistic, for example, it's so much harder for each individual because of how it manifests, and the impact it can have, the forms of trauma it can cause will be so vastly different, and anyone who isn't kind of within those circles, anyone who isn't neurodiverse is not going to have the same understanding of it. Like, for example, I lost my dad when I was 11 years old, and the way that impacted me is completely different to how it would impact a neurotypical person, just because with autism I still don't really understand to this day how I processed it, because there weren't the stages of grief there for it. It was just a different feeling.
So what kind of thing do you think professionals or teachers or anyone who's working with neurodiverse children, teenagers, young adults, what kind of stuff do they need to know and to consider?
That it's not a disability, but it is at the same time. Under the system we live in, working 9 to 5, going to school from 8:30 till 3:30 every day, that is not how a neurodiverse mind is designed to work. It's not designed to function or thrive under that environment at all. But as soon as you remove them from that idea, I was horrific in school. I hated it. I was burnt out constantly. But as soon as I found photography and I decided to go to college and study it, instantly I became happier, I became healthier, I enjoyed doing things. I enjoyed learning because I found a way to learn that worked with me. And not even just with creative subjects. Taking it to, say, someone who's an incredibly visual learner, they're going to be awful if it's just having a teacher read out of a textbook to them, or if a parent's there trying to teach them how to do their homework and they're just saying, oh, well, just do it like this. Some people need to be shown, oh, this is how you solve this problem, and they draw out on a piece of paper, or, oh, this is the chemical structure, here's how you can draw it, here's how you can make it. Everyone has a different way of learning, but with neurodiversity, it's so much more extreme because you find a way it works for you. And as soon as it's not that way, it's not an unwillingness to learn. or it's not an unwillingness to try. It's just your brain physically cannot compute with it.
That's interesting about the school thing, because personally I was very lucky in that the way that the education system is set up is a way that I can function under. So throughout the entire of secondary school, I was a straight A student and I did my homework and all of this stuff. But as soon as I got into college and things changed and I had a bit more freedom, my grades absolutely plummeted. And it's because the same support wasn't there, the same routine and the same expectations. So with the change in environment, that really, really threw me off, which I think could have been avoided if neurodiversity was kind of considered in that. Do you feel as if school and education is kind of good for neurodivergent people? Like, is it enough?
It's a really difficult one because in some cases it is. This is where neurodiversity is really misunderstood. It's different for every single person. The way my autism's manifested itself, the way my ADHD manifests itself is different to how every other person on this planet with autism or ADHD will have it manifest. So there isn't one method that will work for everyone. There's no blanket technique that's going to make school this really safe environment for them. What it really boils down to is schools need to start encouraging individuality within learning, individuality within approach to learning, and give people more freedom in how they express themselves, in how they learn, in how they want to engage. But until that point, schools, workplaces, home life, without that safety of expression there, without that safety of experimentation, without that feeling of individuality and everything you need as an autistic person to thrive, basically, you're being thrown into a system that's designed to not work for you. It's designed to work against you.
It makes me quite sad, actually, because one of the kind of traits of especially autism and ADHD as well is the ability to hyperfocus on a special interest. So having one subject or one area that you are just insanely good at and you love doing, you're really interested and you excel at that. So imagine if all of these people had this kind of support and encouragement to go after their special interests, because it might be paleontology, it might be medicine, it might be mental health, and we would just have all of these professionals who genuinely love what they do, and because of that they will do great. And yeah, I think we're missing out a lot because of the barriers.
Definitely, and I can speak from my own personal experience. Secondary school was an utterly horrific time for me. I struggled to fit in. I didn't understand the environment I was in. A big part of that was the change in environment between primary and secondary school, and what I had happen in my personal life, right in the middle between those two periods of my life. But I did horrifically bad in my GCSEs. I passed most of them, but I was predicted A stars. But because I was so severely burnt out because of the way the education system is handled, it means that if I wasn't lucky enough to find photography, I would be in an incredibly bad position right now. But I found that thing that I was just instantly good at. I wasn't amazing straight away, but I knew what I was doing just naturally. And I think that's another part of autism as well. If you find that thing you're good at, it becomes essentially a part of who you are. It's not just a job, it becomes you. Every day I'm there doing just the menial admin work of it. But when I was in college, I was thriving. I left with triple distinction stars because I was in not only a much more free environment where I could come and go as I pleased, I was respected by my tutors, they didn't treat me like a teenager but a person, and I was doing what I loved. And until education is more kind of free form, until it's got the funding it needs to do this as well, it's always going to be a struggle for neurodiverse people.
If you could change kind of some things around to help neurodiverse people cope in school and thrive, what would you do?
Well, the very obvious one is give them more funding, pay the teachers properly so they're enjoying going in, because no one gets into teaching but for any reason other than wanting to help and teach young people. They do it because they want to help the next generation be better, be smarter, know more. But first of all, they don't have the money for it. So they're incredibly capped on what they can do. But also they need to let kids be themselves. They need to let kids express themselves. And be it from having open access to music rooms for the kids who just love to play guitar or piano or sing, so they can go and do that at lunches, to having quiet rooms so if someone's incredibly overwhelmed in a classroom, they can take their work and go and work in, say, a library. They just need understanding, and honestly, they should train their staff properly on how to spot neurodiversity and how to teach neurodiverse people.
I think a lot of it also comes from differences in communication. A lot of adults don't know how to act around neurodiverse children because they are quite different than what you'd expect in a child. From my own experience, I've been told that when I was younger, I would hang out with the adults more than the children because I found them more interesting. And I didn't particularly enjoy playing, games like made-up games. So I think adults definitely need to know how to interact with neurodiverse children.
I find it with my cousins, both of them are pretend. I feel really bad. I can never remember how old they are properly. That's on me. But they're both 100% neurodiverse. I'm convinced both of them have ADHD, and the older of the two is 100% autistic. But his comes across in being just the most polite person I've ever had encounters with. And it's I will openly say this, it's so weird. It's so weird talking to a 7-year-old who's talking like a pensioner. Who's just doing their weekly shop and is just having that chat with the cashier. It's just not how you expect a kid to act.
A lot of autistic kids are described when they have that type of personality are like old souls, which I find just really funny. How do you think that being neurodiverse has impacted your relationships?
That's also a tricky one because in my family life, it's always been, first of all, my entire family's autistic. I'm not going to hide it. Me and my mother, we both have autism that's manifested in a very similar way though. So when I was younger, it led to a lot of arguments, a lot of clashing heads, a lot of clashing opinions, because we both just couldn't communicate across to each other. But as I got older and I started to realise how autism actually impacts you as a person, and it isn't just me having a bad temper as a teenager, it was being overwhelmed, it was being burnt out, and then being able to communicate that fixed relationships that otherwise could have been damaged. And it's something that just took time. But I also know from the other side of it, from in school, it's incredibly difficult if people aren't neurodiverse or the way their neurodiverse clashes with yours, because sometimes it just does. There's no one correct way to kind of communicate or to build relationships if you're neurodiverse, because it's different for everyone. Every relationship is different as well.
It kind of reminds me of my friend group in secondary school. So there were about 5 of us. We were quite tightly knit, just a really good friend group. And one by one, we realised that we were autistic. And one by one, we each got a diagnosis. And it kind of clicked then that actually these type of people are drawn to each other because it is a different communication style. And I think there's less pressure to conform to what we're expected to communicate like. So me and my best friend, we will have a conversation, but we won't look at each other while we're doing it. You know, we'll be doing our own thing, like maybe doodling or playing with magnets or something like that. There's no pressure, which I think is a really nice thing.
Like, it's interesting you said about the not looking at each other as well, because obviously this is being filmed, but I am not looking into the cameras at all. I'm looking at the walls behind them, because otherwise it feels like I'm making eye contact, and that's something I'm personally uncomfortable with most people. So it's very important, I think, while we're on communication styles, to, if someone doesn't make eye contact with you when you're talking directly to them, it's not necessarily because they're rude or they're uninterested. It's an uncomfortable experience for them to be looking you directly in the eyes as you talk. And that kind of understanding, something that I think's a bit more prevalent now, especially thanks to social media and TikTok and people talking about their experiences.
I've also seen some stuff around the expectation for neurodiverse people to cater to neurotypical people, and how, you know, we're meant to mask all of this stuff and make eye contact and communicate in the normal way, when actually it's not the other way around. So, you know, they're sticking to all of their rules and stuff, when you can communicate in any way. There are no rules.
Yep.
Definitely.
Like, I always found the best communication I had is, like, ironically, when I'm not able to see the person at all. Like, when me and my mates were playing games as teenagers, the way we'd have to communicate and call out, like when we're playing Halo Reach, like MLG, was ridiculous. I don't understand how we could communicate that well. But as I've got older, it's because I realised I wasn't having to engage with them physically at all. There was no person there, we were just talking over a headset. So any form of kind of social interaction was purely because we were choosing to, instead of being forced into that.
Something that has just sprung to mind. So do you think there is a difference in communication between autistic people, but between kind of males and females?
So in a way there has to be, because like AFAB people have a much more difficult time with even getting a diagnosis with autism. The symptoms are a lot more internalized, and it just makes it a much harder experience, meaning a lot of autistic women and AFAB people don't actually get that kind of confirmation until they're young adults instead. But with AMAB people, you can get diagnosed at 2 years old, 3 years old. One of my best friends has a couple of younger siblings who are twins. Both of them are autistic. The AFAB one, like, almost completely non-verbal, like selective mutism. The like AMAB one, though, he's been diagnosed since 2 years old, and it's like quite a severe case of autism, but they both are autistic, and the way they communicate is he's kind of acknowledged constantly with his autism and his needs for very specific communication styles. But this is where the difficulty comes in. The daughter, the sister, isn't. It's not processed yet that she is also autistic, and it makes it so much harder to communicate with her. And I feel like that's a massive issue for probably a lot of families. Autism isn't this kind of small niche condition people have. The brain is literally developed differently in development, and I just wonder how many young women who have massive issues communicating with their families or their friends are actually on the spectrum somewhere.
For our listeners at home, just to define some terminology again, AFAB is assigned female at birth. So this is the name that we give for maybe non-binary people who were raised as, women. And then AMAB is assigned male at birth, just to clear that up.
Probably important point to mention, I'm non-binary as well.
But yeah, do you think that being neurodiverse and, you know, having this different communication style has been kind of a good or a bad thing in your life?
Like, so it's neither good or bad. It is what it is. Like, it's not a negative unless other people make it a negative. It's not a positive unless other people make it a positive. It's just how communication works for you. It's how you communicate. It's how you experience the world, feelings. Every aspect of your life is developed by this one aspect of you. It's not a condition, it's not a disability, it's who you are. And that inherently cannot be a positive or a negative. It's how you let it kind of manifest, how you work with it, how you understand it, that will turn it into one or the other.
And I think the stigma of autism, ADHD, neurodiversity in general being a disability is so harmful for the people that have them, that, you know, are autistic. Because if you're told from birth that who you are is wrong, you know, that's going to lead to some problems. And it's quite well documented that, especially with ADHD, the mental health rates are just awful. It's worse than nearly every other demographic. And it's just, you know, not being noticed, which I think that's probably one of the root causes of it.
Like, definitely, that plays a massive part into it. And I think media portrayal of it as well. Like, it's so common that it's just the joke. Like, autistic characters are the joke characters in kids' TV shows. Or it's things like SpongeBob, where half the cast are, like, I think unintentionally written that way, but it creates this very kind of specific vision of it, instead of it just being, okay, people are autistic, people have ADHD, it is what it is.
I think as well with that, it's misportrayed. I don't know if that is a word, but it is now. So for example, like the most prominent autistic characters within media, like the first one that springs to mind is Sheldon Cooper, because of course. And that is a portrayal of the way that autism can come across in, you know, one type of person, but actually that being the norm, because you see it again and again. So like The Good Doctor, and it's the same type of person being attributed to, you know, a brain type.
Like, this incredibly, like, scientifically nerdy character who has no way of interacting with people, especially people of the opposite gender, and it's harmful. But even within the harmful stereotypes of it, the harmful depictions of it, there is one aspect I really like of Sheldon Cooper, for example. He is always shown as being unable to actually kind of put across his emotions unless he's having a meltdown, which he's seen doing multiple times on the show. But he's also a massive comic book nerd, which is put across every single episode. And I'm a massive comic book nerd. A lot of my friends are. And one very interesting bit of information, and kind of, I don't know if it was the actor who did it or the screenwriters, the outfit designers, but he wears a different Green Lantern shirt. A superhero that is inherently based on emotion, depending on the emotion he is feeling at the time. And every single, like, shirt he wears for the Lantern Corps correlates to his emotions in those scenes. And it's just a very interesting way of showing actually he is still able to communicate this, but in a way he understands. It's not the ability to not understand, like, communicate or not understand your emotions. You just understand and communicate them in a different way.
So this question is kind of, what kind of stigmas exist around neurodiversity?
See, it's a really difficult one because there's so many different types of neurodiversity. Be it from, say, schizophrenic characters are always sociopaths or psychopaths, when actually they just have a severe mental health issue that needs intense amounts of therapy and medication to help with that process. Be it someone who's autistic, like Sheldon Cooper, being this socially inept recluse who just likes video games and science. There's most depictions cannot kind of find the nuance that comes alongside neurodiversity at all. And that's a massive kind of thing. It's a nuanced subject that unless you are part of those groups, unless you're neurodiverse yourself, you may be able to understand scientifically some of it. You may be able to empathize with some of it. But unless you're autistic, you don't know what it is like to be autistic. So say you're writing a book, writing a TV show. If you're not autistic yourself, or you're not getting autistic people in to help create that character, you're going to end up stereotyping it. Same with ADHD. Look at how many shows from the early 2000s, like we all would have grown up watching, where half the cast just have ADHD and it's just constantly played for jokes.
And I think in media as well, a lot of the best autistic and ADHD kind of neurodiverse portrayals that I've seen have been accidental, or they haven't been explicitly said, oh, you know, this person is neurodiverse, but the character acts in a way which actually they are. If they were a person in real life, they'd probably have that diagnosis. The best one that I can think of is The Good Place, because none of the characters, it never explicitly says, you know, these people are neurodiverse, but every single character has the traits in their own different way. And I think that's interesting because it makes me think that the producers of these shows might themselves be neurodiverse, and they're just showing, you know, different people that they've encountered in their lives or different personality tropes, without realising that they're also neurodiverse traits. And I find that really interesting, just the misunderstanding of all of this stuff.
Like, I definitely agree on both of those points. First of all, Chidi is the best example of an autistic character I have ever seen in a show. And secondly, I think neurodiversity is so much more common than people think. It's not anything other than your brain being wired slightly differently, and we still know so little about the brain that more than likely most of the population is neurodiverse. I don't actually think that being neurotypical is a thing, at least in the way it's intended when it's being spoke about, because no two people have the same experiences, the same thought processes, so it's impossible to actually claim anything is neurotypical.
I just wanted to throw a fun piece of information that I learned about, especially autism, in terms of like the stigmas and misunderstanding about it. So people think that in social situations, when autistic people don't know what to say, that they, you know, their brain is blank. They just don't know. When in fact, it's shown in brain scans and everything that in autistic people, especially in social situations, every single part of their brain has activity in it, as opposed to neurotypical people, which only has one or two sections. Which means that it's not that they don't know what to do, it's that there are too many options and they don't know which one they should choose, which I find very interesting, and it helps put a lot of autistic characteristics like in context, because there's too many options.
It could be a good explanation as well for why it's so easy, especially if you're autistic and have ADHD on top of it, why over and under stimulation is such a big issue. Because if your brain's firing at all cylinders all the time anyway, it means the physical world around you is going to be more overwhelming than otherwise. Because I know a lot of people who aren't autistic who have no idea what I mean when I say I can feel the t-shirt I'm wearing at all times. I can feel the clothes I've got on. I can feel the breeze. And while everyone can feel it, to me, it's not just like, oh yeah, I can feel the t-shirt I'm wearing. It's okay, no, I can feel every single move I make and how it pulls. And on some days, that's horrific. Some days, just that kind of extra touch, extra sensation is just more than my brain can process.
That's true. And for sounds as well. especially with ADHD, because people with ADHD are so like sensitive to everything, like external stuff. So I said to my friend the other day, you know, I can hear the electricity in the walls. And I could. It was like a buzzing. And once I noticed it, like it didn't go away. And then on top of that, I could also hear the kettle and some birds and everything else that is going on all became apparent as soon as that one thing kind of got triggered, which I think is interesting. So if you're having a bad day, you know, having all of that as well on top of that is just a recipe for disaster, really.
Like, that's actually a very interesting thing, something I just thought of as well. As technology becomes more and more kind of involved in our lives, every room now has electronic devices in it. I remember when I was a kid, it was still possible to make a room silent. But these days, I can be laying in bed at 2 in the morning, no one else is awake, and all I can hear is just this buzz from all corners of the room I'm in, because there's a TV, there's a PC, there's games consoles, there's phones, and you're so hyper aware to those tiny sounds. Sorry to anyone watching this who's finally figured out why they can't sleep properly at night, because this will be a nightmare for you. It's not something that you can easily fix. But it's elements like that of life that are inadvertently designed against neurodiverse people. It's something that we have no control over at all, and we just have to live with it.
What do you think that people can do to be more mindful about the stigmas around neurodiversity?
It's a really difficult one, because it goes back to an earlier point of it's different for everyone. So the stigmas of, say, an autistic person being unable to hold a conversation might be completely untrue for some people, but like 100% like hit the nail on the head, perfect for others. So there's not really any way to do it that's inclusive of all people. The biggest thing I can just say is just treat everyone with respect. Like, if someone doesn't, like, say you've got a kid who doesn't want to give a family member a hug and you're pushing them to do that, you're taking away their autonomy and you're taking away their freedom of choice. And it's bad enough if they're neurotypical, but if they're neurodiverse, that's like gut-wrenching. It's painful. Just treat people with respect and these stigmas will fade. As autistic people learn more about themselves, thanks to social media and the internet, it's so much easier for people to understand it themselves, though. And while it's never on the case of, like, I would say in this case, autistic people are the victims. Like, I'm not saying that autistic people are victims, but it's just to get the point across. The blame is never on the victim, but there are elements that don't have to be masking that autistic people will just slowly work on over time as it's more understood, as there's more research available, as there's more kind of examples within media of it, there's more representation. These stigmas will just work themselves out because we're slowly finding our place within these industries we were never designed to be in, within these fields we were never designed to be in. Like, or more, I should reword it to these fields and these areas that were never designed for us to be in. We're finding our ways in now, and we're like removing these stigmas as we do so.
I think one example that is, you know, right in my brain, like the moment you talked about that, is office culture and kind of workplace etiquette and the expectation to kind of go out with colleagues and stuff. Because I saw an article about this about half an hour ago. I think it's more of an issue in the US. But someone was saying how they were expected to go out with their colleagues after work. So not only have they done their 9 to 5 in the office and, you know, socialised then, but afterwards everyone was going out for drinks. So that brings up kind of two problems. The fact that they have to go out and socialise, which if they're autistic, they might find very difficult after having been in the office and doing that for 8 hours. And also the expectation to drink, which is a whole other kettle of fish. But it's small things like that people won't even think about when they think about autism and needs.
Like, I think it's also important to mention with ADHD in this case, the addiction rates within people with ADHD is like probably the highest out of any demographic I can think of. And the constant expectation in society for drinking is a massive part that plays into that as well. But I've never understood office culture, and it's a perfect example of it. Like, it sounds like utter hell to me to have to go and work for 8 hours, 9 hours a day with people, and then it's, oh, okay, we're all going to the pub after, this loud, crowded, cluttered environment that you have no control over at all.
Yeah, and it's not you're not being forced to do this, but it's a silent expectation. If you want to further your career, if you want to go and network with people, like, that's the place to do it. And it's so anti-neurodivergent. Like, there's no space for these people, in these contexts.
Also say, if someone says, oh no, I don't like going to the pubs, like, I don't like going to a pub, I don't like going here, I don't like doing this, respect it. Don't challenge it. It's not something you need to try and change. Someone's just told you they don't like something. And we all know, if like someone turned around and went like, oh, I don't like this, if someone then tried to force them to do it, they would hate it. They would be uncomfortable. They would feel unseen. They would feel like invalidated. So just because you like the pub, just because you like going and doing this after work, doesn't mean I want to. It doesn't mean that I dislike the group or anything like that. It just means I don't want to spend my free time in an environment I'm uncomfortable for, and an environment not designed to be relaxing for people like me.
So I've come to the end of my questions. Is there anything else that you want to bring up? Anything you think people should know about neurodiversity?
I might have went into it a tiny bit earlier, but this perception of, especially with autism, of it being this life-ruining condition you're born with is, I can't actually use the words I want to say on this podcast because I'm not allowed to swear, but it's an incredibly dangerous mindset that just causes harm. And there's a reason why autistic people are burnt out 24/7. There's a reason why people with ADHD are constantly struggling to kind of stimulate themselves in ways that are required for their own mental well-being. And the entire world has been built against us. But that isn't a bad thing. That isn't a negative. It means we've got something to try and change. We've got something to work towards. And while it's incredibly disheartening at first to go, well, I've got to go and work a 9-to-5 office job just to actually be able to even live, it doesn't mean we have to do that. If we work on making a world where people can actually express themselves, be themselves, find ways to enjoy life, find ways to enjoy working, it means people won't have to mask every second of their life. People won't have to work jobs that burn them out, because burnout has the exact same symptoms as depression. And then you'll go to a doctor who isn't trained in neurodiversity, who will put you on antidepressants that just make you feel worse. You'll get put in CBT, which if you're neurodiverse, especially autistic, doesn't work for you. And then you're left going, well, why has none of this worked? It's because it's not designed to make you feel better if you're neurodiverse. We need to constantly be working on ways to kind of expand public knowledge and to make people informed about these issues. I said the stuff about being put on antidepressants through burnout from personal experience. I dropped out of university because of such an extreme level of burnout that I wasn't even able to go to sleep. If someone says they're autistic, don't question it. Don't start going, oh, well, you don't do this. Just ask them about it. Ask about their experience. Learn from people. And then encourage them to be themselves.
If anyone wants to get in touch with you, especially about your photography, because as you've said, you're very good at that, where can they find you?
I've got a website which is www.pulsemediavisuals.com. My Instagram is Pulse Media Visuals, my Facebook is Pulse Media Visuals, and my Twitter is something stupid like @PMV_photo, because Twitter just never has a good username available for anything. If anyone has any questions, especially about being able to kind of break into the industry as a neurodiverse person, because it's a skill, you have to learn to network and communicate, and that's very hard if you're like neurodiverse, and especially if you're autistic and you can't communicate that well. It's a very hard thing to do, and I'm happy to answer questions on how to do that. I also specialise in live music, band portraiture, portrait shoots, and anything like that, so book me.
So thank you for joining us today, guys, and make sure you follow us on Lyfeproof UK on every platform, and there'll be another podcast next week, so make sure you tune in.